does not hurry. It warms adobe one shade at a time, loosens frost from fence rails, and invites mules to comment on the morning with soft, practical music. Christopher Houston Carson wakes in that half-light which belongs to rivermen and hunters. He rolls his blanket with a thrift that makes room for miles. A tin cup answers the fire with a small ringing that sounds like yes. He is short, spare, and built for usefulness, where Davy Crockett was a room loud, generous. Certain kid is a trail quiet, precise, going where it needs to and no farther. He learned young. Apprenticed to a saddle maker until the bench felt too narrow for a boy who kept hearing a far road. Knocked politely at his ribs. He slipped west in the company of traders, who spoke Spanish like they'd been practicing with the sun for years. Bensford taught him commerce, Taos taught him courtesy, and the mountains taught him the grammar of weather. Beaver made the early 1830s a kind of currency you harvested from cold water. Carson learned sets and sign, how a bank writes in willow where a lodge might be hidden. How snow tells the stories, one about the last hour, one about the next. The fraternity of mountain men is a quiet democracy held together by cold coffee, and the understanding that luck favors the prepared. Names like Bridger and Fitzpatrick moved. Through camps like constellations, you navigated by them without needing to touch. Kid brought a particular gift, not bravado, not decoration, but attention. He listened the way a mule listens when a trail is narrow. He noticed where a brook hesitates and why. He could smell a storm in a wordless way and shorten a day or lengthen it accordingly. Language is part of attention. Carson traded syllables as carefully as he traded goods. Ute for respect, Apache for distance, Navajo for plain talk when plain talk was the most polite option, Spanish with the soft endings of northern New Mexico, English reduced to the essentials a camp needs to get through. Wintering in a beaver country teaches a man to be small. You make a fire that does not show off. You place your bed where wind forgets it for a while. You cook what the day allows and think it without arguing. There were fights, of course. The West has sharp edges even when handled with care. But the older kid grew, the more he avoided noise that did not move the miles forward. Rendezvous was the festival in this austere church, a meadow along a river where the year-as harvest of pelts became piles of iron and lead and coffee and cloth. Stories traded freely, some more true than others. All of them booster shots for men about to return to places where words were rarer than meat. Young hands watched Kit the way colts watch old geldings, not for show, but for how to be. He taught without trying, keep your powder honest, keep your mouth modest, keep your friends within the reach of your voice at night. He learned also the etiquette of passing through other people's countries. Fires set where fires were welcome, trails chosen to avoid insult. Trade offered before talk ran dry. He could eat with Comanche a day and with a Missouri merchant the next without making either table. Feel like a mistake if Crockett handed us a story about courage with a fatal flourish. Carson begins handing us a story about competence whispered between animals and maps. He married into the land first, a union that winter could not keep. Then a Tulsa home where Chili and Rosary shared a table with rifles that stood in the corner. Like polite uncles, domesticity for Kid was not retirement. It was reverence. It kept his feet gentle between journeys, and gave his silences a place to sit. A trapper's year is a circle made of ovals. Fall up the river, winter down the log road of memory, spring along melt water that tells secrets for a few weeks, summer repairing what the rest have used up. Carson rode the circle until it became a compass he could lend to others. He grew into the kind of man leaders borrow when they begin to suspect their maps are too clean. Not yet famous, he was already the answer to a question men learn to ask when money and purpose venture onto uneven ground. Who can take us there and bring us back? His reputation traveled ahead in useful ways. He will not waste your water. He will not test a river where it is in a mood. He will not talk when listening is the job. In a canyon one winter, he watched a cloud sit wrong on a ridge and moved camp a mile with the kind of authority that does not ask for votes. Morning arrived with an avalanche where their blankets had been. No one made a speech. They poured coffee for the man who had made sure they were there to drink it. Under starlight he could read a slope by touch. Under noon glare he could find shade with the intelligence of a lizard and the charity of a father. He carried a rosary in one pocket and a whetstone in the other and used them both with equal attention. When the fur trade bent toward its waning hats, learning to prefer silk, strange learning the quiet that comes when traps are fewer, Carson felt the wind shift and did not argue. He kept the skills and turned them toward the next kind of work the country would require. And the country ambitious and opinionated, was about to need guides who could translate between what the land allowed and what the capital imagined. A lieutenant with a politician's appetite for mountains was drawing lines on paper that needed to be verified by boots. His reports would become national narratives. For that, he needed a scout who believed in distances more than in adjectives. Kid Carson tightened his cinch and squared his hat. The next miles would be official miles. He would treat them with the same care he had treated private ones. Ink meets altitude. A pen rides behind a mule train. The Republic stretches its arm and asks the mountains to hold still while it sketches. Official journeys are a different weather. They travel with instruments and intentions, with salaried hunger and maps that hope to be right. John C. Fremont brought science and publicity to the trail. Barometers, sextants, notebooks craving the names of unnamed things. He also brought a gift for sentences that could make Congress lean forward to keep the sentences from floating away. He hired Kid Carson to pin them to the earth. In 1842 they moved out along the Platte, where cottonwoods plant their green flags and bison write history in hoof notes. Carson rode with the modest authority of a man who was already committed to bringing everyone home. His guidance was not romance, it was a series of small, correct decisions. Camp here, where wind is less opinionated. Cross there, where the river's voice is friendly. Wait a day, because the sky has promised a mood and will keep it. Men who had never learned the language of landscape began to pick up the alphabet under his quiet tutelage. How a ridge tells you what a valley will say, how a bird's sudden silence means the weather has changed its mind, how a broken twig tells time. They climbed to South Pass, where the continent remembers how to be low, and looked west at a geography that did not care about committees. Fremont rode with patriotic altitude. Carson checked the pack cinches. Both labors were necessary. A year later it was the longer expedition, Oregon's river worries. Then south to the Great Basin's honest emptiness. Maps trembled when they touched the Sierra Nevada and asked whether a line could cross, where stone was busy being forever. Winter answered no in a tone that was not cruel so much as factual. Snow turned paths into conversations about appetite and prudence. Carson's sense for shelter became the difference between a report submitted and a list of names guessed at by widows. There were hard moments, food that decided to be scarce, animals that remembered their wild ancestors too vividly, men who had to be asked to choose between pride and breakfast and who. The kids helped Joe's breakfast in time. He scouted ahead with one other when pots needed, proving, and he turned back without shame when the land said later. Fremont's pen took what Kid made possible and gave it a nation's attention. Reports printed in Washington spoke of peaks and pauses with a clarity that owed much to the scout, whose handwriting did not fill the page but whose judgment filled the days. In 1845 they went again. California in the mind's eye like a promise that refused to stop being made. Politics thickened the air. War's first syllables gathered in corners. Guiding under such a sky is more than navigation. It is diplomacy conducted with silhouettes and distances. Kid kept the party small when small was wise, large when large dissuaded inquiry. He spoke to rancheros with the right hat in his hand, and to native camps with the right silence first. Trouble found them anyway, as trouble does when boarders begin to imagine themselves loudly. Skirmishes threatened to become stories nobody wanted printed. Carson was the one who turned volume knobs down when down saved lives, up when up moved men out of an ambush's mouth. Once, when Fremont needed Washington to hear news before Rumor Ray wrote it, Kid rode east across a country that did not promise to be gentle. He traveled with a speed that looked like stubbornness from a distance and like loyalty up close. He delivered the dispatches into hands that smelled of ink and power, then turned around to return to a world that smelled of leather and weather. Such errands made him famous by accident. Capital learned his name as a synonym for reliable under impossible conditions. He did not stay to enjoy it. He belonged to the work, not the applause. What did Fremont learn from Carson besides roots? How to write reports that respected gravity. How to let the landscape be the main character. How to credit the quiet, the man who chose a ford, the mule that didn't balk, the woman in a far settlement who traded bread for news. Carson learned, perhaps, that a republic draws maps with sentences and that a sentence can be as sharp as a surveying chain. When it comes to the future, by the time the expeditions had finished sketching their portion of national ambition, Kid Carson was a kind of hinge. between older trails made of fur and newer roads made of policy, between beaver talk and telegraph talk, between private competence and public consequence. The hinge would creak necks in ways that still bother a conscience tuned for fairness. War assigns men jobs larger than their preference. California will change flags, dispatches will gallop. A scout will become a courier of events to beg for any saddle. It begins the way a front rolls in, slow at the edge, sudden in the middle, and afterward everyone swears they saw it earlier than they did. In California the air thickened with declarations and misunderstandings. Bare flag rebels stitched the banner and tried on nationhood like a coat they would outgrow in a few weeks. Navy officers discovered that diplomacy suffered from the time it took to cross oceans. Carson's job did not change in theory, move people safely across difficult ground, but in practice, it widened to include the moods of commanders and the pace of history. He guided Fremont through choices that tasted political. He carried messages between men whose signatures carried cannons behind them. Whether they meant to or not, he made sure that when meetings happened, they happened in places where the horizon did not surprise the participants with unwelcome company. When Kearny's column approached from the east like a paragraph eager to join the story, Carson became the comma that made the clause make sense. He led them where water waited, warned them where sand was practicing treachery, and, at San Pasqual, witnessed the kind of fight that teaches respect for terrain in a tone all generals understand. He carried dispatches to Washington that rode faster than gossip and arrived earlier than regret. The journey east was a lesson in distances that the telegraph would soon shorten, but for now it was still a matter of horseflesh and human spine. As a Wild West man, he entered offices where carpets muted courage and delivered words that tilted policy. Secretaries who preferred their heroes eloquent found themselves admiring a man who used adjectives rarely and accuracy always. He could have remained a little while to taste the odd sweetness of being necessary in rooms. He did not. He turned and went back to where events were not yet edited. Borders changed, treaties put their names down like stakes. Maps gained lines that would look inevitable to school children and improbable to those who had seen the ground through it. Carson tried to keep his own ledger clean, help the living reach evening, help the lost find a path, help the loud remember the quiet exists. But the work ahead would not fit neatly inside the scales of a trapper turned guide. It would require a soldier as rank and a bureaucrat as endurance, and would leave behind knots that words cannot untie. A man who knew how to pass gently through other people as countries will now be asked to move people out of their own. Cadence must remain calm while truth remains complicated. Here are chapters a nation reads in a whisper afterward. This is one by the early 1860s. Where elsewhere pulled uniforms west in new colors, agencies sprouted like fence posts well meant, ill-built, or simply convenient. Settlements multiplied on lands that had their own names before the new names arrived. Carson wore Union blue and a colonel's responsibility. Orders asked for the subduing of dying Navajo families whose home was not a point on a map but a fabric of canyons, fields, flocks, and holy places braided together by memory and ceremony. He had parleyed with them before, shared food and terms, known the value of distance kept and promises kept. Now the strategy from above married scorched earth to persuasion, and the union birthed something that would walk with sorrow a long time. Fields were burned to smoke the people out. Sheep well on for legs were taken and slaughtered not for need but for leverage. Bow guns emptied under the pressure of hungry months and cavalry hooves. Carson's hand in this is debated in tones that rarely reach comfort. He argued for mercy sometimes, for rations to prevent vengeance from finding seed in children. He also carried out orders that made mercy late to its appointments. The long walk followed. Men, women, children moving under guard from canyons that knew their names to a boss that did not. The road was not long in miles alone. It measured itself in blisters, funerals, and prayers spoken without answer. At Bosque Redondo the experiment failed in ways ordinary people could have predicted. And officials could have, too. Water disrespected crops, disease learned too many faces. Promises leaked through paperwork. Years later, a treaty would carry dying back toward home, not unchanged, not paid back, but moving again toward the canyons that had kept their rooms unpainted and their doors unclosed. What of Carson inside this? He did not write a defense eloquent enough to erase facts. He did not write an apology large enough to replace them. He worked inside a machine and sometimes tried to oil it, sometimes simply kept it running, and sometimes looked away because men do when the view begins to measure them. None of this unlearns his earlier grace. All of it complicates it. A life can be both a bridge and a barrier at different hours. History refuses to simplify that for our comfort. In the quiet register of ASM or truth, we can say this. Kid Carson spent seasons helping people cross hard ground and one season helping to make ground hard for people who had a prior claim to it. Both are true. The breath should slow here because the country's will did not. After orders, winter. After movement, a chair near a stove. After noise, the steady labor of remembering fairly. When work loosens its grip, a man inventories. Not aloud, not all at once, but in the way he stacks wood and checks the latch before bed. Carson's later years bent back toward towels and small dignities. He served as an Indian agent with the bias of a translator, trying to make two languages say yes at the same time, trying to trade paper for food and signatures for patience. Some days he succeeded. Many days he merely slowed failures so they would do less harm to the children. He farmed, which is a kind of apology the land accepts without asking for phrasing. He wore fatherhood like a familiar coat and let his house be a place where travelers could warm a story to drinking temperature. His health, never theatrical, began to edit his days, a fall, a fever, the way breath shortens its sentences when a body decides to prefer chairs to saddles. In 1868 at Fort Lyon, where the Arkansas writes its brown arguments toward the east, Kid Carson's story closed. Its eyes, he left behind a widow who had learned both patience and insistence, children who knew the exact size of his kindness, and a country unconvinced about what to do with the contradictions it had asked him to carry. What remains trails safer because he read ahead, reports clearer because he refused to let adjectives outrun facts, a legend smaller than Crockett is in volume but longer in its usefulness as a model of attention and a shadow we must own. The season when its competence was yoked to policies that hurt people who deserve better. If we are to keep the good, we must keep the true. How does this hand the road forward? From traps to trails to telegraphs to stage roads, Carson S. Hinge swings us toward a figure who robbed with politeness and left poems stuffed into Wells Fargo-esque daybooks. Country is now webbed by routes and timetables, Romer rides, coaches, news rides, inks, and a thin man in a dust coat will dismount on a hill, wait for a stage, and introduce himself with a rhyme. Mail roads, quiet boots, a bandit who says please. The Old West learns a new kind of theater, less gun smoke, or pen stroke, and the legend machine discovers how much it enjoys a villain who writes neat.